Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Schwartz, and I'm the founder of the LSAT blog. I'm very excited today to be chatting with Anna Ivey, former law school admission officer and current law school admission consultant. How are you doing today, Anna?
I'm good. How are you, Steve?
Great to connect with you today.
Likewise. We've chatted so often for years now, but I think this is our first recorded video, so this is very exciting.
Yeah, it's so funny connecting over email in the past over the years with different changes that LSAC has done to the admission process. But now, with all the recent changes with the new LSAC president, I was really interested to connect with you and hear your thoughts on some of the changes that they're implementing related to the digital LSAT, the rise of the GRE. And so I thought maybe just as a jumping off point, a lot of students are seeing now that more and more law schools are taking GRE in lieu of the LSAT. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are for the average applicant in this situation if the LSAT is looking a little bit tough for them. Is the GRE a good alternative? When do you think that might be a good idea for students to take it, or when should they stick with the LSAT?
Yeah, I mean, they're two very different tests. And so for some people, they find that they do better on one or the other. There's this conversion tool on the ETS website, right, which is sort of the official conversion tool. I have my doubts about that conversion tool because when I see people taking both the GRE and the LSAT, they actually have an LSAT score to compare it to. It's very often, the real LSAT is very often quite a bit lower than the converted LSAT score that's showing up on the conversion tool. So, I think it's an experiment. I think I applaud it. For so long, law school admissions has been, set in stone, and you've seen very little changes over the years and the decades. MBA programs, for example, innovate all the time. Good for them. So this is exciting. This is a big deal when law schools finally start trying new things like this. So I think that's still very much in flux. As I'm sure you know, there are something like 200 ABA-approved law schools. Only a fraction of them are accepting a GRE at this time. I'm sure that's changing. That's constantly in flux. There's been some weirdnesses. For example, I don't know if you heard about this hoo-ha at GW Law School, which announced it was accepting the GRE, and then after the application season opened, they changed their mind. And they actually left a few applicants hanging. I mean, I think most applicants have both if they're going to do the GRE, but there were some applicants who had only a GRE score, and to my knowledge, they were just out of luck. So, there's a lot of funny stuff going on there, but I expect that range to just get bigger and bigger of schools that will be accepting the GRE. For applicants who haven't done either one, I suggest doing a diagnostic test under time conditions. Just see how you do cold, not the real thing. These are the practice ones. And see if one plays more to your strength than the other. And of course, the GRE has a math section, and as we all know, there are plenty of people who go to law school because they think of themselves as bad at math. And I feel a little bit sorry for them because you do have to have some facility with math and some numeracy to be a good lawyer. But they can kind of avoid that in the application stage. So see which test plays more to your strengths. Maybe it's the LSAT, maybe it's the GRE. I would say once you have a good handle on which one plays more to your strengths, put your chips all in. Don't try to sort of spread yourself between two different tests. I mean, I think prepping for one test is hard enough. And then commit. Yeah, is that your sense as well?
To a large extent, I do think that, of course, if you can get a higher percentile rank on one than the other, you definitely want to go with that. But at the same time, I do suspect that the applicant pool is a little bit different, those taking the GRE versus those taking the LSAT. The LSAT is a more select group and more specialized. And so I would think you might get a 97th percentile on the GRE. And as you indicated, that conversion tool, your 97th percentile GRE may not translate into 97th percentile on the LSAT. And then also the GRE has more of the math verbal breakdown. The LSAT doesn't have such a formalized breakdown. And although most students will know that maybe on their first diagnostic ever, games aren't going to go well. And so I think to some extent, applicants should trust that their games scores especially will improve with time. I'm obviously biased because the LSAT's what I do, not the GRE.
Right.
But here's a thought, Anna. What about the idea that because the GRE in part is being offered to solicit applicants who may not have even been considering law school, if you apply with only a GRE score, will law schools think that you're taking law school as seriously as someone who focused on the LSAT more exclusively? Do you get what I'm going for there?
Yeah, I don't think it's a liability. I mean, I think we don't really have enough information yet. We don't have enough data, right? This is so new, but I suspect very strongly that that won't be a liability. Although here's one pro tip for your viewers, and schools have different policies, but typically if you take both the GRE and the LSAT, and there are people out there who have, even if you want to apply on the back of your GRE score, law schools will still see your LSAT scores. It's still part of the report that LSAC sends with your application. So once you've taken the LSAC, it's part of your record. They're going to see it even if you'd prefer they didn't. So think about that before you just kind of go out and
yeah. So let's say like someone has like a 155 on the LSAT and they're not very happy with that score. And then they get, I don't even know the specifics. I know the GRE keeps changing their scales, but let's say someone gets a 155 on the LSAT and then they get a 95th percentile score on the GRE. How will law schools consider that LSAT score, given that maybe U.S. News rankings are going to still show that LSAT score for their accepted students, for their matriculated students?
Actually, a good question, and maybe you know the latest, greatest U.S. News methodology better than I do. Are they still required to report LSAT scores when people are applying with GREs?
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with all the changes. My understanding is that they still are required to report the highest LSAT score of their students to the American Bar Association, and then U.S. News takes it from there. And so I would worry about someone who'd already taken the LSAT, then taking the GRE, but the LSAT score is still like a scarlet letter or something where they have to maybe wait a few years.
That might be, I suspect that policy will probably change over time, right? And U.S. News had to adapt to other changes as well. Remember back in the days when schools didn't have to report data for part-time admissions, for part-time programs. And so it was part-time programs were kind of a nice backdoor into the JD programs because they tended to be a little looser with the admissions standards. And so U.S. News, after some period of time, figured out what was happening, and now schools have to report both full-time and part-time, and it's possible that U.S. News will also adapt to this new environment and they'll start tracking GRE scores but to your point, I think you're right. I think if schools are seeing both scores, and certainly if they still have to report the LSAT score, then you have some of the same issues that apply even if you have just an LSAT score, which is to the extent that you hurt their rankings, that's a problem. That's an issue.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe if someone's never taken an official GRE or LSAT, and then they suspect they're going to do much better on the GRE, maybe you just do the GRE but don't get an official LSAT score on record. But on the other hand, if you already got a lower LSAT score, you might want to keep plugging away at that a bit more. Maybe take it a couple of times because they don't average them anymore. The highest is all that matters.
Right. Yeah. There are different ways to approach that, I think. That being said, people kind of hit a wall with the LSAT in different places, right? Everyone
For sure.
That they're starting with, and if they sort of max out at different places too. And if you're really hitting that wall with an LSAT score for schools that you're interested in, you might still then tack on a GRE, right? If that is considered.
Yeah, you might as well, and certainly if you have a longer timeline. Oh, I'm sorry.
Exactly. No, and that's such a great thing to raise. I think what I see year in and year out with applicants is they don't leave themselves enough timeline to tackle the LSAT, and now in this case the GRE as well. It is so surprising to applicants I talk to, many of them, that I tell them plan on taking it twice. The assumption that you're going to take it once and be happy with your score and you're done. How many people does that apply to? I mean, it's just unrealistic. And so, but people box themselves in with the timeline. If the fall is the first time you're taking it, ideally you want to be submitting your applications fairly early in the cycle. So it becomes tough to even finalize your list of schools if there's still some LSAT score coming down the pike and you don't even know what it is. So ideally, I'd love to have people start considerably earlier with their testing, baking in the possibility of retaking, and then still being able to apply nice and early. But by the time people get to us on the consulting side, very often there's no wiggle room. And it is what it is, you know, and you do the best you can with the timeline that's in place. But if you're starting from scratch, you know, take it from the LSAT expert. I'm not the LSAT expert, Stephen. You know, leave yourself time. They're both tricky tests, and as we all know, test prep does help. So yeah, give yourself time.
It's important enough that it's
such an important thing. Yeah, totally worth it. Totally worth it. And I know it's tough. People have to do test prep while they're in school full time, or they're working full time. They might have families. You know, they have all these obligations, and that's tough no matter what. I see people too struggling with whether they should apply for accommodations or not if they have one kind of disability or another, including learning disabilities, and that takes time too. There's this whole process with LSAC that you have to go through to petition for accommodations, and you have to have documentation, all the paperwork, and then those wheels turn, and that's not something that happens overnight either. And so I've seen people box themselves in with the timing for that as well. So yeah, I mean,
I'm glad you brought up accommodations, Anna, because it's something that there have been some changes on that as well. The LSAC got sued time and time again for being a little bit too strict with granting accommodations, but recently things have gotten a bit more liberal. And now not only are they a bit more liberal with granting accommodations, but there's no longer a mark on students' records.
Correct. So that was a big change.
Yeah. So I'm wondering just what your thoughts are on that, of your experience with that, you setting students up with accommodations. What's the typical process like?
Well, you know, if someone does get accommodations, you know, it depends on what they need and what they're asking for. It can be, you know, you have a broken leg versus, you know, you have ADHD. So I mean, the accommodations are, you know, quite different for different circumstances. But, you know, LSAC has been, as to your point, has been really kind of slow to keep up with federal and state legislation around accommodations in an educational setting. So they were one of the last, if not the last, sort of standardized tests to drop that asterisk that used to be next to the score if you had accommodations, because it would signal to the admissions officer, of course, that that score had been accommodated. So, you know, various government agencies slapped them down and said, no, you can't do that. That actually violates the law. And so now admissions officers don't know whether you've been accommodated or not, unless you feel like telling them. Sometimes that can be interesting. For example, if someone took a test unaccommodated, a lower score, and then gets accommodations, gets a considerably higher score, that might be interesting, right, for an admissions officer to understand, because then the idea would be, well, the accommodated score is probably more predictive of what you'll be able to accomplish in law school, also with accommodations, than, you know, this older unaccommodated score. So, you know, and that's case by case too. But yeah, LSAC definitely dragged its heels and finally caught up with the legal requirements and with other standardized tests. And for example, the GMAT, you know, much earlier dropped the accommodations signaling. So yeah, you'd think that law and lawyer related tests would keep up to date on those things, but sometimes
you would think so. I mean, part of my speculation on that is because LSAC for such a long time has been a monopoly. In fact, you know, the ABA rules were saying, you know, valid and predictive exam, and the LSAT was the only one that had valid, you know, sufficient evidence to justify that claim. So they were the monopoly. But as I saw, like, it was kind of funny. I did a graph once where, like, once business schools started taking the GRE, the price of the GMAT leveled out. They stopped raising the price of the GMAT because of the GRE competition.
And I'm guessing it's not random or just a coincidence that all of a sudden the LSAC is improving, right? Its delivery going digital, offering more opportunities during the year, right? Partnering with Khan Academy, right? It reminds me of when Uber first hit the market, and all of a sudden these really crappy taxis and taxi companies where I was living, all of a sudden then start accepting credit cards. You know, thank you. You know, this is thanks to a good competitor entering the market. So, you know, that certainly benefits applicants. I'm glad they have some choices now. I think it'll be so interesting to see over the years as they collect more data, how good the GRE ends up being as a predictor, over time, and then also the correlation with bar passage rates. Because of course, when we saw law school application volume dip quite a bit, and law schools and police officers were taking anyone who could fog up a mirror, they ended up, 3-4 years later with people who couldn't pass the bar, right? And to my knowledge, there is a correlation between the two. So I'll be kind of curious how the GRE correlates with bar passage, and we'll have to see, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have all the statistical know-how to thoroughly evaluate the recent study that ETS came out with about the GRE's validity, but I still remain skeptical. I was skeptical of the Harvard study that I think was last year, where they looked at their own students, and their own students who scored highly on both the GRE and the LSAT, of course, do well in law school, but those are Harvard students. I worry more about the lower ranked schools that maybe aren't worth going to, just using it as a way to get more applicants in the door without the additional hurdle of taking another exam when maybe considering other grad schools.
And I don't want to get too cynical about the law school admissions process, because I think you don't have to have 100% cynicism. I think there are sort of well-intended and straightforward motivations for some of these things. However, to your earlier point about the rankings, it helps schools not just to generate more applications, but also to deny more applications, right? That helps them in the rankings. So, to the extent that they're drumming up and attracting more applications by adding another test, there is a cynical way to interpret that as well. I don't think that has to be the only one, but for the non-Harvard, to your point, it's about getting bodies in the door, but then also ideally being in a position where they can turn people away.
True. Yeah, the yield is also an important thing. One nice change that LSAC is adding is to increase the number of times the LSAT's offered per year, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts are as I'm looking ahead to like 2020 now, and I'm seeing that they're going to offer the LSAT virtually every month, maybe 9 or 10 times a year. So
hallelujah!
Yeah, that's nice,
it's
right?
About time. I mean, when I crossed paths with people who were taking the GMAT or the GRE, my sister just took the GRE last month. Both fresh, in my life, and what a luxury to be able to walk into some test center in some office park whenever it's convenient for you, right? And I'm trying to remember. I think with the GMAT, your score before you even walk out of there, right? I can't remember if that's the case with the GRE. But that's just a long time coming. It was just old-fashioned and difficult to restrict people to 4 times a year. So if it's once a month, that's great. I think ideally it ends up as the GMAT model, where you can take it any day you feel like it, right? And get your score pretty instantaneously. So a girl can dream. I think
that would be incredible. I mean, I wish for that too. I think it may be a little more complicated with the LSAT, because with the GMAT, you can just plug in different numbers, plug in different vocabulary words. Maybe the LSAT, they have a different, more limited pool of questions they can pull from. But
correct.
I'm sure they're working very hard on it. But the question that comes to mind for me is the application cycle still is traditionally, they open in like the fall, they end in like the late winter, early spring typically. But now if the LSAT is round the clock, when is too late to apply for the cycle? I mean, now we're recording this in January. January LSAT is the end of the month. Is that too late? Is the next year February?
Yeah, and I'm so curious what your experience has been this year with the new, with the new LSAT schedule, this cycle. What I have found, and of course, we're a limited data set. I don't want to generalize too much, but what we've been seeing is that having the later LSAT dates basically gave people just another excuse to procrastinate some more and kick that can down the road. So we're seeing people show up with, the November scores and now thinking, oh, I'll take it again in January, or maybe I'll take it again in March, whereas, in the grand scheme of things, this is all kind of late in the game, right? I mean, schools are already making offers every single day that goes by, right? So as I say, starting early is so important, because I think it doesn't benefit applicants in any way to kick that can down the road. And so those extra dates and kind of pushing it out, I think, with as in the law, they call that an attractive nuisance. So, I think those later and more frequent test dates might lead people to adopt a timeline that is not in their best interest. I think in terms of the admission cycle, it still benefits people who apply early. I would love it if people have all of their LSAT scores or GRE scores by, say, September 1, because then you've got those locked down, and then you can finalize a list of schools and start working on these applications. Until you finalize your list of schools, it could be a lot of make work. If you have your heart set on Stanford and then you get your score back, well, Stanford's application is a little different from Berkeley's, a little bit different from UCLA or USC, right? So it really mucks with things when you're still waiting for this really important data point, right? And it's really important factor in your application. So I don't think that's changed anything in terms of the application cycle. However, what I have seen in the last several years is that law schools have been really stretching out their decision-making timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you submit your application nice and early, you might not have heard anything from them even by their deposit date in April, which I find shocking and unprofessional, because they're so quick to, take your application fee and then you hear nothing from them. Kind of appalling. But they've really stretched out their decision making so long that the impression I'm getting is that for that deposit deadline, they're making offers to the people they really want and for their first choices. And then they wait and see what comes back, right?
Yeah.
And then they know how many more slots they have to fill. And of course, even people who put down deposits can always withdraw and put down a deposit somewhere else if they get off a wait list. So there's all this stuff that happens after the deposit deadline. And I've seen so many offers get made after the deposit deadline. So even when someone comes to us really early, I give them the heads up that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And you really need to hang in there up through the summer before orientation starts, because there's still movement happening then. I don't like that system. I think it's horrible for applicants. I mean, if you get that call in July, you might have to move across the country. You might have a spouse who has to move jobs or whatever, right? You have to deal with housing. It's just goofy to have these important things happen so late, but they're kind of hedging their bets too, right? Because they know that people are applying to so many schools, and even with deposits, it becomes this collective action problem, because because so many decisions are still being made or offers are being made over the course of the summer. That means you still have this musical chairs during the summer. I mean, it's terrible for admissions officers too. I wish they would just kind of fix this. I mean, you don't see that so much with undergrad admissions or MBA admissions, because they have a round. It's not necessarily rolling at the more selective colleges. They have a date by which you submit your application, and there's a date by which you get a response, right? And it's just predictable, and you might not get the answer you want, but you know when it's coming, right? And then depending on what that answer is, you can then make decisions going forward without whether you want to apply somewhere else or take this offer or that offer. But with law schools, it's just this gigantic can of worms for the entire cycle. It's a mess. It's a mess. So as I say, applicants really need to hang in there. The one thing that I'm curious about your experience, the one thing I've seen applicants do, because it's stretched out so much, is they might apply with 1 score or 2 scores or whatever, and then they think, you know what, I'll take the LSAT again and see if I can get it even higher, right? Even though that might be February or March or whatever. And they're thinking, I might still be in limbo then, and they'll get another score. My instinct is usually don't do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, some schools have a policy that if you are so much as registered for a future LSAT, they will not treat your application as complete, even if you already have an LSAT score on file, which makes no sense to me at all. Registration is just that. You could wake up with the flu, you could cancel the score, who knows? But we saw that happen in the last couple of years. Schools somehow changed their policies. It used to be the case that I think schools wouldn't know if you registered, and all of a sudden they started finding out when you registered, which I think is nuts.
Wow, that's really something that they get, they kind of dig into LSAC's computers, and LSAC shares that information.
Well,
with them, huh?
and that's kind of dodgy, in my opinion, about LSAC, which is LSAC is just a consortium of the participating schools. It's not a standalone entity like I don't know, College Board or whatever, which means that law schools all technically have access to the information because they're a consortium, right? So I find it appalling that schools can see your registration, and I find it even worse that they then mess with your intended timeline. So we saw someone who had submitted with an existing LSAT score and then found out from the school, oh, we see you've registered for a future one, which was just her sort of insurance policy, right? She was just hedging in case you're waitlisted or whatever, and said, so we're not going to even look at this until that new score comes
That's
in.
terrible.
Or even worse, it's after our deadline. So we're not going to, what are they thinking? This is bananas. So there are risks involved, and some schools are being kind of nutty about how they're handling that. But that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two, and this is where that you have lots to say. I find that when people take it twice, great. You can see a jump there. Once they start taking it a third time or more, I start seeing convergence, right? And your experience might be different, but typically when you're starting to think about a third test, let alone a fourth one, chances are it's just going to end up validating a previous score. It might ideally validate the higher score. Sometimes it validates the lower score, and that's even worse, right? Then you're like, oh, I would have been better off not doing it at all. So I generally discourage people from taking it more than twice. And as you know, it used to be the case that you could only take it, what was it?
It was 3 times in a 2
3 times in a 2-year period, and then they listed that. It used to be you'd have to get some letter from a law school that you hadn't even applied to yet, saying yes. It was ridiculous. I used to get those calls when I was dean of admissions. I'm like, I don't know this person. I have no idea if this is legitimate. I used to just kind of rubber stamp them. I'm like, that's fine. I don't care. But finally, they did away with that. But I kind of worry that it invites what I call magical thinking. We're all prey to magical thinking in different areas of our lives. But with law school applicants, one of the forms of magical thinking is, I'm just going to keep chasing this LSAT because I know that the first time, the second time, the third time is not my true score and doesn't represent me fairly, right? Which is what every single addendum always says, they're useless, right? And somehow things are gonna change, that fourth time or that third time. And I don't usually see that happening. Kind of curious what your experience is or what your
Yeah, I mean, it is hard. I do see a lot of students emailing me. They've taken it 3, 4, even 5 times over the period of a couple of years. And that is sad. I think a lot of those students are prone to magical thinking, especially if nothing is changing in how they go about studying.
Right.
And so I would say a lot of students I encounter these days, a lot of them are actually on their 3rd or 4th take. And I don't necessarily have a problem with it depending on how they've gone about it previously. A lot of them get bad advice or outdated advice, sometimes from like a college pre-law advisor telling them, take it and just see how you do.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. So, so frustrating.
That so happens. Like you have one job.
Yeah. But at least they're not averaging multiple scores anymore. So that first diagnostic dry run, unfortunately, it's on record and it might not look pretty, but I think that given law schools taking the highest,
you get a do-over. Yeah.
You get a do-over. And then you might, after that, someone might take your typical big name classroom course with 30 to 50 people or even more in it, where maybe the student needed personalized attention, or they were working part-time or full-time, or had kids, or were in college. And so they weren't juggling everything. But then later, if you're in a position where you're studying, you're only working part-time, or you're in the very fortunate position to have parents or someone else supporting you to be able to study full-time, then that's where magic can happen. But it all depends on your circumstances.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Another form of magical thinking that I've seen is, sometimes you do know that life is definitely going to get easier, 6 months from now or whatever, for whatever circumstances. But a lot of times people don't know that at all. They're just banking on the assumption that somehow, even though my life is really tricky right now and I have to get up at 5 a.m. to study, somehow when I retake it, my circumstances will be less strenuous. Why? Why do you assume that, right? Chances are no, it won't be easier, which kind of is a good segue to this other thing I want to ask you about, which is I see a lot of applicants when they're taking the test or prepping for it, they assume perfect test taking conditions. And then they just fall apart when, somebody's smacking gum or there's construction outside the window or some dumb proctor, I don't know, calls time wrong and has to do over, whatever. And they just freak out. And then they're so convinced that whatever their score is has been, lowered because of those imperfect conditions. And so then they want to retake. And my advice is, you're never going to get perfect conditions. It's just probably something else, when you retake it. And when you're studying for this thing and when you're prepping for it, you need to train for imperfect conditions. You're never going to be sitting in some, vacuum.
Yeah, definitely not.
And, if you're a future lawyer and future law student, the LSAT is nothing compared to the bar. The LSAT is even nothing compared to the property exam I took, which was a 6-hour take home. The 2 bar exams I took, California and Louisiana at the time, were both each 3 days long. So if you wig out because, somebody made too much noise during your LSAT, you're going to have a really tough time with these other very high stakes tests in law school. And then of course the mother of high stakes tests, which is bar. So if you think that's holding you back, you've got to fix that. You've got to fix that, and better do it earlier rather than later. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I would say that you definitely want to practice in more realistic conditions. This is actually a topic I've gotten pretty deep into lately the past few months. I've been doing creating a lot of resources around it. But the 2 biggest things would be to simulate test taking conditions with all the distractions. And then the other part is to have strategies to deal with nerves and anxiety, like meditation, or as one of my fellow LSAT tutors calls it, like focus training, to make it seem maybe a little bit more palatable to some, but basically just to improve your focus, strengthen it like a muscle, and then also take some practice exams in coffee shop, library, a place with some ambient noise.
The espresso machine.
Yeah,
going,
oh God, yeah.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I'm far from an athlete. I'm sort of the opposite, but my athlete friends, I get the sense that, when you're training for an athletic competition, you don't assume perfect circumstances then either, right? So I think this has to be thought of in the same way, right?
Yeah, and you've also got to do enough practice runs so that the real exam is like just another prep test. So if you're taking an exam that's going to be numbered as LSAT 90 one day, then you take exams 84, 85, 86, all of them realistic conditions, and then if you have at least 10 exams under your belt under timed conditions, then test day is just another one of those things. But one idea that occurs to me when we were discussing earlier about accommodations, if the distractions really just are too much and they're diminishing your results too much, then if you could get accommodations, one thing you can request is a distraction-free environment where you're the only one in the room. And that doesn't solve the bar exam or future events, but at least that
it might,
maybe
you can get accommodations. But yeah, there comes a tipping point where it's considered a disability, right? And then you can get accommodated for it. But in terms of just the day-to-day stuff going on, you got to figure out a way to perform well under those conditions, right? So anyway, this is sort of learning curve for people when they're applying, and unfortunately for some of them, it's sort of the first time they've had to deal with it. So sometimes it's a surprise, but that's where you and I come in, I guess, because we've kind of seen everything under the sun, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If you're doing this for a while, it's the same issues over and over. It's the same things over and over. One question I had for you, Anna, coming back to the lower versus higher, when do you write an addendum? Let's say someone takes it 155, no accommodations. They take it later, they get a 170. Maybe that was with accommodations, maybe not. Is that the sort of thing where, is there a hard and fast rule on when someone should write an addendum, or is that more just like if it makes you feel good?
Well, okay, let me back into it from that. Sure. Never write an addendum just because it makes you feel good. And I would venture that 90% of the addenda out there that people either do write or want to write are to make themselves feel better. and to satiate their, or deal with their own anxiety. And that's not the end game here. The end game here is what is useful to an admissions officer. That's frankly all that counts, right? And sometimes the things that you do to make yourself feel better are at odds with that. So there are a lot of dumb addenda out there that actually don't add any value, or they just raise red flags, right? If you write an addendum saying, oh, my grades were horrible, and because I wasn't passionate about the subject matter, and then I discovered my past, and well, guess what? You're not going to be passionate about everything in law school either. You're probably not going to be passionate about most of it. There are going to be certain things that you get really into, but if you don't perform well, if you're not passionate about it, then grad school might not be for you, right? So it could go wrong in a number of different ways. In terms of how the schools perceive those LSAT and DESA, it really varies. I think some schools, I think Michigan comes to mind, for example, that says if you have a disparity that's greater than X, I don't know, 5 points or 7 points or whatever, it's not even optional. Like, we want to hear why that is. Most schools don't have a policy around, do you have to talk about it? And you would know this better than I, but to my knowledge, there is a margin of error with each of these scores, right? And sometimes the jumps that the schools are identifying for triggering an addendum is within that margin of error. And I'm thinking, like, what are you supposed to say? You didn't write the test, you didn't score it. You might have done nothing differently, right? And it's just the variation in the score, right? And at the end of the day, you don't actually know. You actually don't know, right? You might say, well, the first time I took it, I really screwed up the game section, and then I didn't the second time or whatever. But a lot of times, if it's a 3-point difference, 5-point difference, even a 7-point difference, maybe it's just, well, I studied differently, or I studied more. Is that useful? For me, I would say no, just let the higher score speak for itself, unless the school specifically says to you to write an addendum, in which case that's what you tell them. I studied more, I studied harder, whatever, and call it a day. Because ultimately, if you're not happy with a score, you don't necessarily have to tell the admissions officer to take your word for it, that one is the better predictor than the other. And to your earlier point, now that they're not averaging scores anymore, just, whatever that high score is, be grateful for that, and don't worry too much about that lower score. But, even with the accommodation situation, I think it can be helpful if you explain that one was accommodated and the other one wasn't. Of course, then you're also telling them about your disability, which you're not required to do, right? Under various laws, you do not have to, and they're not allowed to ask, right? But, assuming that you're going to get accommodations in law school as well, it's not like it's going to be some big secret. And here's the other thing that I see a lot of applicants being unclear about. There's really no stigma attached to it. Maybe there was in times of yore, or maybe in some other environments, but law school admissions officers see accommodation situations all the time in law schools. And so, and as I understand it, there are a lot of, I went to a seminar recently that dealt with accommodations law for educational settings. And I lost track at one point. There was like 11 different laws that govern this.
Wow.
This patchwork of, I'm a lawyer by training. That stuff doesn't intimidate me, but it's like, oh my God, there's a lot to keep track of there. Ultimately, what helps getting accommodations, for example, in a school setting is if you can show that you've had them before. Right? So if you get accommodations for your LSAT, that's only going to help you when you're asking for accommodations on the in law school for exams, and then also on the bar exam. That's not a bad thing, right? So there are some people who put off getting accommodations because they feel shame around that, or stigma, or sometimes it's from the parents, particularly non-US parents. That's very stigmatized. For these purposes, it's not shameful in any way. And hey, if it gets you a better score on the LSAT,
that meshes with my thinking. It seems like there's no real reason not to get accommodations if you think they could help you. And if it also paves the way for the bar or other things, then it's also worthwhile there too. There's really no downside, but I also don't, like you said, I don't really see a reason to necessarily tell them, since you're not required to.
Yeah, that's right. I had a thought, now it's gone. I'll come back to it later.
Okay. All right. One other, something else on this?
Oh wait, it came came back.
Okay, good. Good.
There's no down. The worst they can do is say no. If you apply for accommodations, the worst that can happen is LSAC says no, you don't meet our standards. There are all kinds of professionals on their end that reviews that stuff. You really can't influence that in any way. There's not really a good way to, try to massage that. And if they say no, that's probably it. I've had some parents call me and say, we want to sue LSAC because they didn't grant accommodations. I'm like, that's fine. Have you ever been involved in litigation that might get resolved 7 years from now?
Yeah.
Life, right? So the worst they can do is say no. And if they say yes, good, right?
Yeah, great. Nothing to lose. Law schools will never know you were denied accommodations, nor would they probably even care. But
Right.
yeah, I think and this comes back earlier to the point you said about starting early. It takes a long time, the accommodations process.
And you have to get the neuropsych evaluation, and those are not that hard to get and schedule, but they cost money, and you factor that in too, right? But you're going to need your neuropsych evaluation if it's a learning disability in order to apply for
there are many pieces involved. Yeah, many pieces involved.
There are.
You have to juggle and pull together.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. One other topic I wanted to make sure we covered today was the digital LSAT.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that, it's coming, we're now in 2019, it's July, half of students get the paper and pencil, half get the digital. LSAC chooses for you, unfortunately. And then September, it's all digital. So what should applicants do? What about there are a lot of students out there, I've been hearing from them, they're stressed about trying to get it out.
I would be too.
Yeah.
I think that's completely nuts, because if anything, for any given test, you want to at least be able to compare apples to apples, and here they're not, right? It's hard enough comparing a previous test to a future test and try to standardize, right? But mixing and matching during the same test, that blows my mind. I don't know what they were thinking there. And what to tell applicants, I wish I had a good answer to that, especially because you can't control it, right? It just gets assigned to you.
Yeah.
Prepping for a digital test, as you know better than I do, is different from prepping for a paper-based one, right? So it's just a mess. I think if ever there were a justification for doing some kind of LSAT addendum, this might be it,
okay.
right? Because it is so new and it's so different, and I don't think anyone would fault you if you had really no great way to prep for it, and then all of a sudden you get assigned this digital thing, and you're the guinea pigs. LSAC is making you the guinea pigs. That's not your fault, right? And to the extent that you don't think you were performing at your best, then I think you could say as much that you were in that, you're basically beta testing for them, right?
Yeah. I mean, they've done some small pilot tests, but the reports I've seen have not been that encouraging necessarily.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So what have you been hearing?
Well, so for example, they're going to be on Microsoft Surface Go tablets, which I think hardly anybody owns. I'm actually recommending that students get a tablet of some kind to practice on.
Right.
LSAC is going to release some familiarization tool. It was going to be in December. Now it's going to be hopefully this month, January. But the idea is that you're going to be able to practice digital LSAT questions on your own device. And my understanding, of course, is that a tablet is different from a computer. But unlike, let's say, a Kindle, you can't really draw all over the page. So on the digital LSAT, you have scrap paper to the side, but you can't really underline quite so smoothly. You can't circle quite as smoothly. It's more restricted, the tools that you can use to interact with the text on the page. Right. So I'm just telling students, try to take it by June.
Bite the bullet. Yeah.
Well, I'm telling them, try to get out of the way now. There's been a lot of news over the past few months. So I'm telling everyone who comes along, your timeline is 6 months from now. Great. Get it done by June and apply next cycle. But July, that's when you open the digital LSAT can of worms. And I'm hoping that it'll be more interactive and flexible, that they'll make some adjustments. But it took them so long to even do this that I'm wondering, if they were going to make a better version of the digital LSAT, how long would that take? It would be several years.
Well, I think almost certainly they will, right? I mean, when I think back to when the Common App has been rolled out, and they revamped it, now they're on Common App 4.0, and this has gone on for decades, right? No question, there are going to be wrinkles that they have to iron out, and they're going to all of a sudden have all this feedback, right? And one hopes that they keep kind of refining the test and making it better, and particularly the delivery. But yeah, how long is that going to take? Who knows, right? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I want to talk because I'm not the most tech savvy, but LSAC is not the most tech savvy either. And so I think that it's going to be a very slow process. And so if you can get it out of the way, that's the ideal. Before get out of the way and do the paper and pencil. I mean, that's
right.
the ideal. But if it's the digital, then maybe that's justification for yet another retake if you need it.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that a lot of applicants, especially if they're not watching this, are going to be in the same timeline pickable that they have been historically, and they're going to wait until the fall, right, to take it for the first time. This was a bad year. I wish to do that, right? Even worse than normal. It's
certainly a strange one.
It's gonna be a little, yeah, it's gonna be a little messy. And I think a lot of times there's not gonna be like a perfect right or wrong answer about what you should do, right? You're just gonna have to play it by ear, and if you have to course correct, you course correct. But I don't envy applicants this coming cycle. I really don't.
Yeah, lots of changes all at the same time.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to digest.
Yeah, circling back to that timeline issue, let's say you said earlier, like it'd be ideal to get your applications in September 1st, like first available opportunity. You apply and you're just waiting basically after that point. But let's say that you want to take it in September or November or January, what have you. At what point is it not worth it to get let's say you retake it, you can get a few points higher. Maybe you can get 3, 5, 10. Obviously people are hoping for magic, but let's say at what point is it no longer worth it? Where if I was only going to get 2 points higher, better to just get it out of the way and apply early.
Right. I think that's right. And part of it requires you, without magical thinking, to try to really gauge how you might do on that future test. And I don't know what your experience is. My experience is that applicants are really terrible predictors of how they're going to do, including the second time. And of course, you always run the risk of the score going down, which, isn't the end of the world because you still have your high score, but optically that's not so nice, right? So I would say January is probably a good cutoff. I know even now there are people who are planning on March. Some of them missed the registration deadline for January. I guess they're expecting more than a month, or that they had up to a month to, and anyway, the timing didn't work out, so now they're bumped to March. And for less selective law schools, that's not a problem. They kind of have later deadlines or just rolling basically the entire year, the entire cycle. But for the more selective law schools, March is really late in the game. However, because schools have been stretching out their decision-making timeline so much, you probably do have another bite at that apple. Chances are, especially if it's a reach school for you, probably you're still in limbo. Probably you won't get a final decision before that March score comes back. So, I don't fault people if they want to take March, but you're expecting an awful lot if you're doing that, right? You're assuming the March score is going to be awesome, right? You're assuming the school hasn't dinged you before then, right? It's not ideal. It's not ideal.
How does applying later affect scholarship money? Is it kind of the situation where the scholarship money is just kind of running out by then?
So with scholarship money, meaning it's money coming from the school, it's not like a student loan or whatever. It is first come, first serve in a lot of ways, but schools also handle things differently. So there's a range there. So some schools don't give out financial aid awards until, I don't know, April or whatever, and they, give you your financial aid letter at Admitted Students Weekend, or, so sometimes you just don't even know what it is until fairly late. Other times you hear right away. So, GW, for example, notifies people, I think, with their admissions decision, which makes sense. But yeah, later in the cycle, they've already awarded, or a lot of schools will already have committed to awards to other people, right, that they've already made offers to. And with a financial aid budget, and I've had that job, you have a certain financial aid budget, you better not overcommit yourself. And it's so hard to predict those things because you don't know who's going to accept those offers, right? You can make some guesses based on past data, but we don't have that crystal ball, right? So it's really tricky to try to figure out, like, at what point you've overcommitted yourself for financial aid. So that's very much in flux, but yeah, and that's another reason why getting in early probably benefits you compared to getting it later. Is for scholarships. That being said, a lot of people want to negotiate their scholarships, meaning, it might benefit you to wait and see what other offers come back so that you can negotiate the amount, and so that's just another reason to do everything nice and early so that you have those offers on the table sooner rather than later. Trying to think of a scenario where it would benefit you to be later, and I can't think of one.
Well, I was thinking one potential possibility is that, let's say law schools, they have their budget allocation for giving out scholarships. And I know that they're obviously they're overcommitting themselves and then playing this dance, right, to some extent.
Right.
But let's say towards the end of the cycle, maybe they still have some money left. And so if you applied in February, they were being a bit tight-fisted, but by April, May, June, they've got to spend that money for that application cycle.
That could happen, but it could cut the other way too. They might have decided, we were a little bit too loosey-goosey, and now we've just got to really tighten things up. So there's no way to know, right, which way it's going to go.
Yeah, such a crapshoot. Wow.
and then if you get your offer after that deposit deadline, and for just mental sort of internal purposes, I think of any offer that comes back after the deposit deadline, sometime in April, you're basically on the wait list. And that's okay. As I was saying earlier, there's still lots of movement over the summer. But if you're on a wait list, you weren't their first choice, chances are. And so you're probably not going to get a whole lot of money anyway at that point, right? You're not really trading off very much, meaning law schools use scholarship money as recruiting tools. It's quite different than people have experienced on the undergrad side. Scholarships are recruiting tools, which means they're going to offer money and discount their tuition for the people that they're trying to recruit away and lock in from, more prestigious schools or hiring schools or quote unquote more competitive schools. That's all that is. So if you're finding yourself on a wait list or you're still lingering during the summer, they probably don't have to do a lot to recruit you, right? And that's true as well. Like if you get that call during the summer, you're not going to have a lot of time to make a decision. They might give you 24 hours. You're not really in a position to negotiate or
crazy.
Go, brainstorm and I see a lot of applicants really going nuts at that stage because ideally they think about their preferred hierarchy of law schools very early on and have a really clear sense of what their own priorities are with the law school. And that can very often include visiting. A lot of applicants don't visit law schools, even though they did when they were applying to college, right? So if you wait until the summer to try to figure out whether you would accept an offer from a particular school and you don't have much time to make that decision, it's tough. A lot of people really struggle with that, but like, you should have thought of this earlier, and you have to make
earlier as always, yeah.
Now, very quickly, and you snooze, you lose. Because if you don't take that offer within their window, they can just keep moving down the list, right? At that point, they're really just looking to fill that seat, right?
Yeah.
That's their big priority.
But let's say we're towards the end of a cycle, and we're even in May or June, and students are waiting to hear back from wait lists and deferrals and whatnot, and they basically just a money question for them, where they want to go wherever they're going to get more scholarship money, more merit aid. At that point in the cycle, what would be some ways they might be able to negotiate scholarship offers or play schools against each other, despite these theoretical 24-hour deadlines? How real are those then?
Well, if you have a 24-hour deadline, you don't have any leverage. You just don't, right? But you do have leverage before the deposit deadline. That's really the big breaking point. So before the deposit deadline, they've already made you an offer and they want to close that deal, right? And so if you want to negotiate, you want to do it before they turn to the wait list to fill your spot, right? So what you need to do is show them documentation of scholarship offers that you have from other reputable schools, and then you ask nicely whether that gap can be narrowed or whether it can be matched, right? Worst they can do is say no. They're not gonna retract your admission, if you ask for more money. So that's the worst outcome there, is you ask for more and they say no. But a lot of schools will negotiate. And it's funny, when I hear privately from current admissions officers, they're really unhappy about that scenario. Some of them even find it just completely distasteful, even though they have to do it. I don't find it distasteful given how expensive law school is and how much they're charging for it. That's like, accepting the first price when you're buying an expensive car, right? You wouldn't. I think it's financially sensible to see what you might be able to make happen, because ultimately, and admissions officers know this full well, people sitting in the classroom, they're not all paying the same thing. They're all paying something different, right? So in that universe, of course you can ask, and there's nothing wrong with that.
And also, if you're a future lawyer, it's able to negotiate. And
yeah,
from what you're saying, it sounds like there's no bluffing here, though. Like, you do want to actually show them a real letter from another school.
Yes,
and then
they
say,
will
would you
expect
please
that.
match or surpass this?
They will expect that. And then if it's not sort of roughly a peer school, they're probably not going to care, right? If it is a peer school, they're going to care more. So this is part of the goofiness of this whole system, which is that this incredibly important data point, the price, you don't find out until the very end of the process, which is bananas, right? But it is what it is. You can't change that in this current system where everyone's paying something different, right? So you have to apply and be admitted before you can find out what they would charge you. It's a little bit like our healthcare system, right? nobody knows like how much
get the bill at the end.
Cost until you get the bill. Like, that's crazy, right? So it's not a system that I defend, but the advantage is that you still have that room to negotiate. Again, before deposits are due. I think after deposits are due, that might be magical thinking. I have seen people get scholarships off the wait list. That's not the norm, though. So I think you just want to manage your expectations at that point.
That makes perfect sense. So it just sounds like you got to have a strong application and be a compelling applicant, and then you'll maximize your chances to be admitted a bit earlier, and then you have some more time to play around and negotiate.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, we could go on and on, Anna, but this has been a blast.
We could, and let's do this again.
Definitely. This was a lot of fun. Good to catch up and hear what things are like on the other side of that LSAT admissions divide.
Absolutely.
But what's the best way for folks out there watching to reach you?
Oh, go to our website, AnnaIvey.com. That's ANNAIVEY.com. And although I've been accused on discussion boards of having invented my last name, that is my real last name. So don't forget the E before the Y. And then you can come find us, or find us on Facebook or Twitter. But the website is going to be the fastest way to get a hold of us.
Okay, great. So AnnaIvey.com, IVEY. And again, for those who don't know me, Steve Schwartz at the LSAT blog, on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and all that good stuff. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching, and all the best.
Thank you, Steve.